There's a lot of people flipping out over the Electric State and how shit they thought it was, and I'm not going to bury the lead here. I was impressed. I thought it was pretty bad, probably not as bad as everybody else is saying. These movies get very difficult to rate because they have this epic source material that inspired them to get created in the first place, and like so many movies that are adaptations, they just fall painfully short. So let's take a quick look at the source material. I mean, without even having to read to actually go through the beats of the graphic novel, just look at the artwork and the color palette. Again, very Fallout. You have a lone character with this kind of recognizable mid-century style, something reminiscent of upbeat, plucky advertising that's very friendly. And it's mirrored against these really destitute and hopeless settings. You have the isolation here, an individual plugged in, staring at the ground, zombified. Who knows what his brain is doing? But we would look at this the same way we would look at a guy by himself, overdosing on a drug on a bench with nobody around. And today with social media, this hits harder because we know how even though you're plugged in, you're still so isolated. I mean, this is a really beautiful picture right here. When I first heard about this movie, this is the first thing I remembered from the actual graphic novel was the ducks. It's just such an obvious contrast. It's like a snack that has salt and sweet and crunch and savory all together. It's the kind of friendly nostalgia, it's the silliness, it's the color and the forms and the soft edges paired with the destruction and the obvious signs of violence and decay, all against a backdrop that's very desert and destitute. Like there were things here and now there's not. And as much as it's very retro futuristic, it also feels very near future, like Black Mirror. Like these are, I mean, you got a Safeway and a Chevron down here, but these are things you can imagine. It calls to something that exists in our real life. So it's almost like past, present, and future are all melded together. And it's a very unique, it's very familiar feeling. And once it hits on that style, that's where it can pull on your heartstrings because you're immediately invested into it. Just beautiful artwork stylistically. It's reflective, it's minimal, it's kind of depressing and hopeless. It's even disturbing in some scenes. The TLDR of the plot is that Disney in the mid-century created robots for their theme parks, and that led to AI that became ubiquitous in our society to do service jobs and to do labor jobs. And eventually the AI ran out of control somehow and they all rebelled, and that led to a war. So the style is very much a Fallout. It's that mid-century retro futuristic sheen where everything's in kind of a stylistic arrested development, and you don't want to think about it too much about how we have this out of control super intelligent AI, but then the rest of technology is kind of stuck with like green screen Mac computers. Now the movie starts with Millie Bobby Brown, who is an orphan, and she spends the movie setting out to find her brother, who she believes is wrapped in the body of Cosmo, this character from the beginning of the era of these AI robots. And she goes off to find where he supposedly really is. She ends up teaming up with Chris Pratt, who's playing dollar store Chris Pratt in this movie, and then they end up fighting generic bad guys in the form of Giancarlo Esposito. I learned today that he doesn't pronounce it Esposito, and Stanley Tucci, who also does his best impersonation of token, bald, generic white guy CEO villain. So my entire experience with this movie really hinged on vibes. I think that's what was the selling point of the original. If you look at the landscapes, you look at the size of these figures, the color palette that they chose, the stylistic design, the juxtaposition of the recognizable and even kind of silly and ridiculous characters with the presence of this wasteland where everybody ends up suffering as a result of this kind of consumeristic nightmare run amok, where people become victims of their own role as consumers. You have people with VR headsets dead in the street having died with the VR headsets on. It takes all of the advertising properties that are made to seem friendly, that are recognizable, that are nostalgic, and it makes them menacing. It turns them against us. And in that way, it's the same type of horror that you see with like Five Nights at Freddy's. And I think it's a bit of what's appealing to us about these types of alternate reality properties, where you do have that nostalgia, especially with the advertisements, the recognition of kind of 50s commercials and sheens and aesthetics, very upbeat and optimistic. Whether or not it actually was, you think it was a better time. And to have that spun into something so twisted and unrecognizable, you get the sense of it's not supposed to be like this. It's like when you're a kid and you have this view of your family, and then you get to a certain age and you realize your parents are fighting and getting divorced, and oh my God, there were infidelities. And it's that coming of age thing where the things you held as kind of sacred and special end up turning, like souring, like milk. And it's a very gut-wrenching feeling, and that's what I've always gotten from these types of properties. Now, as far as the vibes go, you might hear these comparisons quite a bit. People are comparing it to Ready Player One. I think the Spielberg comparison is probably the most apt, because you get this kind of upbeat and hopeful like band of misfits that are going against the bad guys, and it has, God, the orchestra music through the whole movie. I'm like, this is the most bland, generic orchestra music. It doesn't fit the fucking tone. I'm like, what is this? Then I find out it's Alan Silvestri who's actually responsible for that brand of orchestra music. And to have it met with like that vibe, it was just so disjointed, and it bothered me throughout the entire movie. Now, with so many of these movies, especially in like the Marvel universe, where the Russo brothers are no stranger to, the vibes are off with the humor. They cannot decide what they want the style, the tone of the movie to be with regards to the drama, how serious it is, when to have a comedic break. It's like you have different committees that are trying to wedge in beats, and none of them are communicating with each other. In the beginning, you're supposed to feel for Millie Bobby Brown's character because she's an orphan in this like new dystopia, and she's with her foster father, Jason Alexander, who's supposed to be the fat lop that's like just collecting the check, and he's abusive or whatever. But he's Jason Alexander, and he's like ends up fighting this robot, and he's like, you're talking to the captain of the wrestling team from such and such high school. Like, he's playing a cartoon character of himself, and none of it has any weight. You don't feel for the gravity of her situation, having lost her parents, living in this dystopia, the hopelessness, again, that the source material exuded so much of. And then Chris Pratt, everybody's saying that he's doing his best Chris Pratt or Star-Lord impersonation, which is 100% true. This is not Chris Pratt at his best in a silly role or a dramatic role. It's like the worst of all worlds. There's a scene in the middle where a scientist is admitting to having a hand in something that's very disturbing, which should have all of this weight. And when you get the realization of what he did, Chris Pratt says, hey, everybody calm down. And then he kicks him in the balls. And he's like, yeah, it hurts more when they're relaxed. And for the content matter that's specifically being discussed, to take it to that point, it seems like just incompetent storytelling. There's no other way to do it, because those tones don't match up, and it gives you whiplash. It's not the comic relief. It just comes out as it's music that doesn't flow well. It seems disjointed, and it hits the ear wrong. I mean, you have the premise, which is amazing, and the graphic novel presented it as such. The idea of an AI revolution coming in the form of these recognizable mascots going rogue, it has an appeal. We know the aesthetic. We've seen it in Fallout. The Five Nights at Freddy thing, yes, horror fits with that premise. Transformers, yes, camp fits with that premise. Fallout, yeah, you get the nostalgia and the angst of a twisted reality. That fits. And the source material, I've heard it described as macabre. It's kind of a quiet hopelessness of modernity, and watching it kind of go back to the dust as everything that we've built has led to this slow burn decay. That type of heart-wrenching hopelessness fits, and they didn't capture a single bit of any of that in this. It was generic Hollywood making, a bad imitation of an upbeat Steven Spielberg film. I would say the acting was pretty bad here, and I never know if it's the director being content with whatever take they got the first time around. I never know if it's the script being too trash for anybody to do anything with. Maybe the actors are phoning it in, or if the actors are just confused. And then you end up getting some mishmash of bullshit that doesn't work on screen. I think a mix of all of that was here. I think there's also a problem with kid actors. It's always such a crapshoot because they could be extremely convincing. I mean, you can think of the best kid actors of all time. Think of like Haley Joel Osment in The Sixth Sense. Think of really moving, dramatic scenes that grab you. More often than that, though, you get this really kind of cookie-cutter, lifeless presence that's about as dramatic as what you would see from Teen Disney. And in the opening scenes, it showed Millie Bobby Brown with her brother. That is what it felt like. It wasn't even on the level of Stranger Things. It was kind of sub-network TV drama, in my opinion, for a bunch of reasons, and it wasn't enough to get me to give a shit. So if you're just looking for something to watch, I give this like a 5 out of 10. if you have any standards for movies in this genre, you're going to be disappointed. Even if you have standards for kind of generic Hollywood blockbusters, this misses the mark of what people might think of as like worse movies that stay with you longer because they did a better job of getting the vibe right. Now, if you're familiar at all with the source material, or even if you go out and just read it now before you watch the movie, this is going to fall to a 2 out of 10. It's going to be such an egregious departure from what it should have been that you're going to see it as like an unforgivable sin. You won't even want to look at the things that it actually did right. So once again, we're left with more money than anybody would ever know what to do with. We're left with the same talent that's been recycled through all of these big budget movies, and we're left wondering how it is you can have all of these resources towards a project and have it fail so much at the fundamental levels. Time and again, we see lower budget movies just run away because they actually have the fundamentals, the mechanics of storytelling fleshed out. That's all the audience cares about. The audience doesn't see the dollar amount. They feel the script and the characters and the setting. It is the design. And I don't know if it's just because it actually is that difficult, even with all the resources at your disposal, to do that consistently. But we're left with the same thing. Producers throwing just insane amounts of money at movies with just the most unimpressive results. So that's my take on The Electric State. It's a nothing burger. This is not a movie people are going to be searching for in 2 months. If anything, I'm more interested to see what the Russo brothers do after this. So that's all I got for today, guys. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think in the comments. Until next time, this is Bromley. I'll see you.